Okay, so we talked about utilitarianism, and utilitarianism basically says the end, maximizing average happiness, justifies the mean. All we care about is the end. We could go to the opposite way of thinking about things, away from a focus on consequences. Utilitarianism is a form of what we call consequentialism. We could go to the opposite extreme and say, well, we only care about means, and we should do right no matter what. So we're going in the opposite direction, and we're getting into what's called deontological moral philosophies. And the sort of, big sort of king of deontological moral philosophy is Kant. And Kant sort of boils everything, oversimplifying by a lot, boils everything down to the golden rule. Don't do unto others what you would not want them to do to you. Okay? So we need a little bit more detail than that, because that's a pretty high-level advice, and exactly how we would implement that is a little bit tricky. It's obviously very appealing, and sort of the two big, most prominent people who've interpreted this in the late 20th century are John Rawls and Robert Nozick, both at Harvard, and sort of did most of their important work in the 1970s. And John Rawls wrote a book called The Theory of Justice. That was his first big one. And then he wrote a couple of other books that expanded and updated and so on and so forth out there. So, A Theory of Justice. And what Rawls says is the way to look at this is to imagine basically everyone being a sort of disembodied soul waiting to be born, but you don't know who you're going to be born to be. So you don't know which, womb you're going to end up in. And what general rules for society would you endorse if you didn't know who you were going to end up to be? And he says two general rules. One is basic human rights must be respected. And then, after that's fulfilled, and subject to that being true, so he sort of said this is just the absolute number one priority, then after that, social institutions should maximize the welfare, and sort of oversimplifying this. It's like a several hundred-page book, so you can imagine there's a lot of oversimplification here. Social institutions should maximize the access to what he calls primary goods for the least well-off person. And exactly what he means by primary goods is a little bit tricky here. He's actually getting around the utilitarian consideration. He's not going to look at welfare. Primary goods might be something, they're the things that all people are presumed to want. And so that would be presumably, good health and income and education and opportunities and lots of things out there. So social institutions should maximize primary goods for worst off. And this is what's called the Maximin criterion. So we're going to maximize the minimum. So we're going to maximize the worst possible case, because the worst possible case is that as a disembodied soul, you are born to be the worst off. As with all sort of philosophy, when we get down into the details, this gets a little bit tricky. Well, how small is this group of worse off? Are we sort of talking about the lowest 1/5 of the income distribution? Are we talking about, well, even sort of more narrow than that? We're talking about, homeless people? Well, even among homeless people, some people are sort of more worse off than others. Are we talking about, among the relatively able-bodied homeless? Or are we talking about, people with severe mental illness or something like that? So that gets a little bit tricky at the level of implementation. The other sort of criticism of it is this sort of assumes, if we place sort of all of our weight on the level of primary goods for the most worst off, we're assuming that people are what we call infinitely risk averse, that they're not willing to tolerate any possible slightly worse outcome in the worst case scenario for any possible benefit in anything better than the worst case scenario. And that's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit unclear why we would sort of believe that. Sort of a different way of looking at this is that almost everybody is willing to tolerate some degree of uncertainty in their life in exchange for, the possibility of making rewards. This way of looking at things kind of says, no, we don't think people operate that way. So there's lots and lots of ways in which, although this has sort of become the most common way of thinking about whether we should have a social safety net or how strong the social safety net should be, or sort of what would an overall just society look like, there are lots of sort of people who've come back at this. Robert Nozick says essentially, well, my interpretation of the golden rule is basically that people should not interfere with each other. So sort of instead of sort of looking at this as sort of a communal agreement that's arrived before anyone knows who they are, people do actually know who they are. And so not interfering with each other is not a matter of leaving each other alone as disembodied souls or being fair to each other as disembodied souls, but rather taking account of people's actual particular humanness and their actual individuality. And sort of to sell this sort of extremely simple and short, he's sort of looking back to an earlier philosopher named John Locke, and this ends up being a sort of relatively sort of libertarian sort of philosophy out there. So he is essentially going to say that, we are who we are, and we have the capabilities and things that we have, and what matters is not the overall structure, which is what John Rawls would say, but rather how things have come to be. So if you say, for instance, have made a lot of money, and you've done it by making a quality product for a reasonable price, and you're sort of fair and respectful to your workers and suppliers and the environment and so on and so forth, then great for you. You deserve every penny you got. On the other hand, if you made a lot of money and you did it by doing things that were morally wrong, well, then you don't deserve that amount of money. And so he's more focused on the process and focused on thinking about what a fair process is, and less sort of focused on what's a fair result. Both of these philosophies concentrate, and in general Kant concentrates almost exclusively on what would be fair or what would be just. And whether or not justice is the only thing we care about in economic ethics, I think, is an open question. So in my next video segment, I'll go ahead and talk just a little bit about some alternatives to that viewpoint.